What's up, everyone? Welcome to MTXChess. My name is Nathan. Thanks for watching this video. Like and subscribe. New videos coming every week. Today we're talking about another chess fundamental and endgame fundamental, and that is king pawn versus king endgames. We're going to go through all the basics: how to queen a pawn, how to maneuver around your opponent's king to queen a pawn, how to defend if you're on the defensive side, how to defend against your opponent queening a pawn, how to make it tricky for them, and we'll talk about some special scenarios. So let's just get started. The most important thing to know is to know when you can queen a pawn without the assistance of your king. Let's say you're white in this position. Can this white pawn get to the end of the board before the black king gets there? This can be a tough question, and if you're playing a blitz game or you're playing a speed game, you don't want to count out, okay, one move for white, one move for black, another move for white. It just takes too long. So there's a simple trick for understanding this, and what you do is you draw a diagonal line from the pawn to the end of the board it's trying to queen on. So the pawn's queening on the 8th rank, so you draw a diagonal to the 8th rank. This creates effectively a box with the pawn. It's kind of an imaginary box, but here's the box, right? All these squares, if the black king can move to any of these squares, then the white pawn is not going to be able to queen. The black king will be able to catch up to the white pawn. Let me just give an example. So if it's black to move in this position, black can move here, and you see that now black is inside the square of the pawn, right? Let's say it's white to move. Black can just keep moving over, and eventually black's going to catch up to this pawn, right? Now black covers the queening square. If we go back to this situation, let's say we're white to move, okay? White moves here, and here's the square of the pawn. Now the black king is outside the square of the pawn. So the black king moves here, but the black king's still outside the square. The pawn moves forward. The black king can chase it and chase it and chase it, but eventually the pawn's going to queen before the black king gets to it. So if you're ever in a pinch and you need to real quick find out if you can queen the pawn, you got to make sure that when it's your turn, if you're white or whatever side's queening, that your opponent's king is not inside the square of the pawn. This is a super important concept. Like if it was white to move and they moved their king here and then black moved here, now black is inside the square of the pawn and white just made the endgame a lot more complicated. All right, so that's how you know when you can queen a pawn without the assistance of your king. Let's now talk about how to queen a pawn when you need your king. And to do that, we have to understand a basic position, and this is the basic position. So white is trying to queen their pawn on the 8th rank, obviously. Now, who wins this position or who has the advantage in this position depends on whose move it is. So we'll start by saying it's black to move. If it's black to move, white has won this position. The black king is on this square, has to move off this square, and the white king covers this square, and the white pawn covers these two squares. The only square available to the black king is this square. In moving here, the black king has to step out of the way of the pawn, and now the white king can move forward and cover the queening square. On white's next move, no matter what black does, white will be able to queen and get queen the pawn or promote the pawn to either queen or a rook, and white will be able to checkmate. If we go back to this position, what if it was white to move in this position? The black king takes away this square from the white king, so the white king cannot go to this square. If the white king moves to any of these squares, the pawn gets captured, right? They're no longer protecting the pawn. The black king captures the white pawn. So white is basically forced to move to this square. The problem with this, though, is that this is a stalemate, which results in a tie or a draw. And you don't want this. But if it's white to move in this situation, there's no way to avoid a stalemate or draw, because you either move to this square and force the stalemate, or you move away and then black captures your pawn, and a king versus king obviously is going to be a stalemate. So it's so important to know and to understand that having to move, or whose turn it is a factor in who wins and loses these kinds of endgames. So now that we understand this, let's go back to a basic position, a basic fundamental position. This is, if you're white and you're trying to queen your pawn, this is basically the position you want to get into. From this position, no matter whose move it is, white's going to win the game. Let me show you. If it's black to move, right? White with their king is creating a wall in front of the black king. White has what's called the opposition. The black king has no choice but to step out of the way to either side. It doesn't really matter which side the black king chooses. Let's say he chooses this side. Now our white king can kind of march around the black king. So our white king flanks the black king. Now the white king covers each of the squares that the pawn needs to promote. The black king is kind of relegated to moving along the side the side here while the white pawn marches towards the end of the board. Now let's say it was white to move in this position. Obviously, it's easy to understand that black has to step out of the way and that white would win that position. But if it was white to move, it's a little bit more subtle. White's going to move, has to pick a side, right? You never want to retreat as white, so you want to move over to the side. If black were to move over to the opposite side, that would be a blunder, right? Because white can just come and now they cover all the squares, just like we talked about. So what black's going to do, if it was black to move in this position, is they're going to move right in front of the white king. So if white moves back, the black and white kings could be just dancing back and forth, and it's not going to be productive at all. So what white chooses to do is advance their pawn. And now the black king, if the black king moves here, the pawn will queen, right? So the black king has to stay in front of the pawn, so they move back to e8. And now the white pawn advances to e7. Now this is the position I showed you earlier, and it's black to move. So white wins this position. The black king moves to f7, the white king moves to d7, and the pawn eventually queens on e8. So if we start in this position, no matter whose move it is, white wins this position, okay, if it's played correctly. Now let's say this is the position down here. This is a little bit of a different story, okay? If it's white to move, if it's black to move, let's start with black because it's just a little bit simpler to understand. If black has, excuse me, let's put black back on the board. If it's black to move, they move to the square, basically stepping out of the way of the pawn. White can flank the black king. And if black moves back, white can do this again. And white can basically push the black king all the way down the end of the board. And now we're in this position right here. And all white has to do is march their pawn up to get into the position we just practiced, where the white pawn is on the 5th rank, the black king is on the 6th rank, and the white king's on the 6th rank, and the opponent's king is on the 8th rank. And remember, no matter who's moving this position, white's going to win. So that's the scenario if it's white to move, right? What if it's black to move? I'm sorry, that was the scenario if it's black to move. What if it's white to move? If white moves here, right, the black king obviously is not going to go away and kind of give the white king flanking power. So what the black king is going to do is just stay in front of the white king. And they can just go back and forth, back and forth. Now, eventually, the white king is either going to come straight back, which would not be good because then you're giving the black king space in front of the pawn. Or what white's going to decide to do is push the pawn. If you're black in this position, you always want to stay in front of the pawn on this e file. So black's going to move here. The white king cannot come to this square. The white king cannot come to this square. So the white king either has to move away out this direction, but that would give black the square right in front of the pawn, so they don't want to do that. Or what they could do is they could move directly back behind the pawn. And this wouldn't be good either because if they move directly back, now the black kings come in this direction, okay? And white hasn't made any progress. So what white might do in this situation is push the pawn. Now it's black to move. And this is super important to know if you're playing black and you're trying to defend against this. In this situation, you always want to move directly back. You want to keep your king in front of the pawn. Moving back to the side would not be a good move. You want to avoid that as black. So if black moves directly back, if the white king tries and scoots forward up to d5, now you can block the king off and black has the opposition here. The white king can't come to any of these squares, and so the white king's stuck moving back again behind the pawn, and the position kind of repeats itself. And eventually, we do this enough times where black stays right behind the pawn. The white can check. Now we're going to get to this position where now it's white to move. And we remember from the beginning, white to move in this position results in a draw, okay? So kind of some subtle differences there. If this is the position where the pawn is on the 5th rank and the king is on the 6th rank, white always wins this position. If this is the position, it depends on who moves. So, right, if it's black to move, white's going to win. If it's white to move, the black king is going to be able to basically block that pawn. And remember, if you're black, you always want to stay as much as you can on the same file that the pawn is on. If you have to retreat, you want to retreat along that file. Alrighty, let's talk about one more important thing in king pawn versus king endgames, and that is the rook, some of the special things around the rook pawn. So a question might be, can this pawn queen? Now, if it was like this, right, we draw the square of the pawn, we'd see that the black king is well outside the square of the pawn, and so this pawn's going to have no problem queening. Now, this endgame is a little bit different because unlike the previous endgames where the white king can basically maneuver the black king around so as to open up the queen square for the white pawn, these rook pawns are a little bit vulnerable because they're on the edge of the board. And so as long as the black king can make it to this h8 square, this queening square, or if we were on the a file, it would be the a8 square, this white pawn is not going to be able to queen, regardless of whether or not the white pawn has the support of the white king. So obviously in a situation like this, where the black king is within the square of the pawn, this pawn's not going to queen. But let's say we're white and we start getting our king involved. In a position like this, if it was white to move, we push the pawn up. Black's just going to block like this. If we come around to the side, black's going to come here and they're going to be threatening our pawn and we're going to lose the pawn. So as white, I guess we'll just keep pushing forward. And black is going to move straight back. And then we're going to get into a position like this, right? And so if we try and check with the pawn as white, black's going to move into this h8 square. And the thing is, there's no file to the right of h8 where we can where the king gets pushed. And so we're going to end up in a stalemate. So anytime the black king can make it to the queening square of the white pawn, doesn't matter if the white king's involved, that game's going to end as a draw or a stalemate. If you're white, what you want to do is you want to get in this position is you want to do your best. And this the black king might have to be even farther away. In this position, right, you can obviously queen the pawn, but one thing you can do if you're white and it's like this, if you want to, you can put your king on this g7 square, and this creates a wall. Now the black king has no chance of getting the h8 square, and the pawn can queen just fine. If the position was this, right, the black king being well within the square of the pawn, what you'd want to do is maneuver your white king to this g7 square to create the wall we just talked about. And now this white pawn is going to queen no problem. So yeah, the king pawn versus king endgames are very subtle, and you need to understand how you can promote and how to maneuver your opponent's king, maneuver around your opponent's king. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment, like and subscribe. New videos coming every week. Thanks.